Welcome to Going Out on a Limb, the Anatomy of the Upper Limb. I'm Dr. Jim White, and together with Dr. Alex Macknow, we'll be bringing you the story of the anatomy of the upper limb, the joints that make it up, the muscles that act at those joints, their innervation, and blood supply. I will be telling the basic anatomy story at the beginning, and Dr. Macknow will follow up at the end of the course by talking about some of the common injuries and pathologies that affect upper limb function. So let's begin with Lecture 1. Lecture 1's first job will be to identify the players that make up the upper limb. And the first picture that you see on this slide is both a front view, shown over here on the left, and a back view of the upper limb, shown or depicted in light blue. Note first off that a lot of you think that the word arm or term arm is synonymous with the upper limb. But actually the arm, as we will see, only corresponds to a part of the upper limb, the part of the upper limb that's actually closest to the trunk. And we will now identify not only what constitutes the arm and the bone that is contained within it, but also the other names and terminology related to this body part. So let's do that by looking at kind of a vignette view through the musculoskeletal anatomy of the upper limb, right down to the joints that make it up, and this will give us an opportunity to identify not only the bones of the upper limb, but certainly the basic anatomy of the joints that they form and the body parts that they define. First off, the upper limb is actually suspended from the trunk by a series of two bones, and these two bones make up what's called the pectoral girdle. And the pectoral girdle, basically, we have two of them. This is half of, obviously, one of them. The pectoral girdle is formed by what we refer in the lay population as the collarbone in the front that articulates with the shoulder blade or the scapula in the back. And the two bones come together and form something called the acromioclavicular joint. So the clavicle, in addition, it's not shown on this slide, also forms an articulation that attaches the entire pectoral girdle and therefore the upper limb to the trunk. So that's the pectoral girdle. That's the first part of the anatomy of the upper limb. Then, moving down the upper limb, anatomically, the next part of the upper limb, which begins at the shoulder, which is formed by a structure known as the glenohumeral or shoulder joint, the major bone that's articulating at that joint will be the humerus. So the head of the humerus articulates with the scapula, and it is the bone that forms the structural framework of the arm. Note, however, that the arm ends at kind of the mid-joint of the upper limb, which is called the elbow. And you can see at the elbow, we have an articulation between the end of the humerus and two additional bones that I'll just outline by their single letters. The bone on the outside or the thumb side of the next portion of the body is called the radius, and the bone on the pinky or little finger side of this body part is called the ulna. Note that the radius and the ulna are found anatomically in the forearm. The forearm, therefore, begins at the elbow and actually ends at the wrist. And the anatomic word for wrist is carpus. So what actually makes up the carpus? Well, we're going to look at this in a little more high magnification view, but the carpus actually is formed by 8 individual carpal bones. And we'll name them at some point, but we're introducing their location at this particular point in our conversation. So there are 8 carpal bones, and you can see some of them will articulate with the ends of the radius and the ulna, and some of them will articulate with an additional series of bones, which are called metacarpals. And you can see that there are 5 metacarpals, 1 associated with the thumb, and 4 of them that form basically the beginning point of the fingers. But as we'll see in a moment, we can't actually visualize these metacarpal bones easily because they're covered by muscles and tissue and skin that make up the palm of the hand. Then as we move out to the thumb and the fingers, and they're still called the thumb and the fingers anatomically, we can see that what makes up the bony framework of the thumb and the fingers are a series of phalanges. Note that each of the 4 fingers has 3 phalanges each. You can see one there, a second one there, and a third one there. But the thumb, however, only has 2 phalanges, with only a single joint separating them. And going forward, we'll be talking about the different actions that occur at these joints and the muscles that perform those actions. So, using this as a jumping off point, let's now look at a little more detailed view of the hand and the wrist. So first off, the picture on the right side of the slide shows a normal hand covered by skin, muscles, and obviously the underlying bony framework. So the first point that we want to make is this body part right here is the distal end, the lower end of what we call the forearm. There's the forearm. So we see the thumb, certainly positioned there, and we see 4 fingers sweeping across there. Note that at the base of the thumb is a prominent swelling containing a number of skeletal muscles that act on the thumb, and over near the base of the pinky is an additional, somewhat smaller swelling. These swellings have names, of course. The swelling that exists at the base of the thumb is called the thenar eminence. The word thenar means palm. And over at the base of the pinky, or the little finger, is a hypothenar eminence. Note that these eminences partially cover some of the 8 bones that make up the anatomic wrist. But here's the interesting point. The wrist basically is an area that is largely in the beginning part of the palm. So in reality, the wrist is really an area that's right there that's partially covered by the thenar and the hypothenar eminences. Most of the lay population thinks that the wrist basically is the part of the upper limb that exists just before we move into the palm, but it isn't. And the wrist anatomically, as we say, consists of 8 carpal bones. So then, additional nomenclature. You can see that the thumb is always referred to as being digit number 1. The index finger will be digit number 2. The middle finger, digit number 3. The ring finger, digit number 4. And the pinky, it's still the pinky, or the little finger, is digit number 5. So going forward, we may name some muscles associated with digit 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 and number them in a similar fashion. Then, note that there are a number of creases that are characteristically seen at the wrist and within the confines of the palm of the hand. So there are a series of wrist creases, series typically of 3 of them, that mark approximately the location first of a series of joints that are formed between the one end of the radius and the smaller end of the ulna and a first row of carpal bones. And then there are a series of flexion creases, a middle and then a distal, that are found largely over some of the carpal bones directly. So when you flex your hand at the wrist by pulling the palm of your hand toward your forearm, you can see the additional features, the deepening of these wrist creases. Then note that there is a radial longitudinal crease. Radial longitudinal crease, it kind of defines the location or the boundary of the thenar eminence. And this presumably is the lifeline of palm readers, a very important determinant of, obviously, aspects of future prospects in life. Then as we move out toward the fingers, there typically are a series of 2 transverse palmar creases, and these are going to be a little more evident when we begin to flex our fingers and obviously make a fist. So all we're doing now is introducing some of the basic anatomy of the hand and pointing out the actual exact location of the anatomic wrist, which is here, versus where the lay population always thinks it is, which used to be there, which is actually part of the forearm. And that kind of raises the next issue when we look at the other side. On the other side of the palm, this is actually called the dorsum of the hand, we see a little more obviously, a series of extensor tendons. Extensor tendons, named because when the muscles that belong to them contract up here in the forearm, they make the fingers unravel and fully extend at the joints formed between the phalanges that are found within them. Note an interesting additional anatomic point, and this is found over here in this area, which is kind of an interesting area called the anatomical snuff box. It is a small depression that's found between a couple of the extensor tendons that act on the thumb, and presumably in medieval times that's where snuff was placed before it was dutifully passed through one's nostrils. Then note the proper anatomic name for the thumb. The thumb is called a pollex. So any muscle which acts on the thumb is going to be named for its action with pollex as part of the terminology. And having said that, we can see that a couple of these extensor pollicis tendons are actually forming the boundaries of the so-called anatomic snuff box. Then there are going to be some very interesting muscles that are found between the fingers, or technically between the metacarpals, that help make up a substantial component of the palm and dorsum of the hand. And these muscles, since they are found between the metacarpals that we saw previously were buried in the palm of the hand, are called interosseous muscles, literally not giving a clue as to what they do, but named because they are found between metacarpals within the confines of the hand. Then, basic question that I ask my first-year medical students when I first meet them, and we're talking about anatomic parts, is I ask them, is this item that's depicted in the picture on the left really a wristwatch? Well, everyone, of course, says, yes, it's a wristwatch, but the problem I have with that is, artwork notwithstanding, you're actually wearing that watch on your forearm. So technically speaking, or anatomically speaking, that is not a wristwatch, it's a forearm watch because you're actually wearing it on your forearm. So the next time you're in the market, stop into your neighborhood jeweler and ask if you can see a series of forearm watches and see what their expression will be. But you're speaking correctly anatomically because this is where we actually wear this structure. Let's now look at a couple of slides using our digital anatomy atlas from the Visible Human Anatomy Atlas. And this will give an opportunity as we move through the course to kind of give a three-dimensional approach to upper limb anatomy. So first I'm sweeping the upper portion, or the arm and shoulder, back and forth. And you can certainly see underlying the skin are a series of prominently illustrated skeletal muscles that largely cover the pectoral girdle and the shoulder joint, and as we'll see, act upon one or both of those body parts. So this gives us a nice little perspective into the anatomy of where we're going. And what we'll be able to do using this program is we'll be able to click on various muscular components, for example, and we'll do this kind of in order, and remove them progressively as we move through our anatomy conversation by simply hiding them. And there we kind of see the view that's shown there. But one of our areas of emphasis is not only going to be to illustrate the various muscles that act on, in this case, the beginning part of the upper limb, but we can use additional pictures like this because part of our story is going to be to illustrate the arrangement of nerves, shown in yellow, the blood supply, the arterial blood supply to the upper limb, logically shown in red, and the veins that drain the upper limb that are shown here in blue. So we'll have some extensive conversations about them as well. But the other point that we want to make as we end our first lecture is you can see here the arrangement or the location of the clavicle and how it is articulating with the sternum at the tip of the arrow. There it is. And then over here, as we move out in the other direction, we can see the location of the shoulder joint, where the head of the humerus is articulating with the scapula and using the pectoral girdle to suspend the humerus and the rest of the upper limb from the trunk to permit a greater range of movement. So that's the basic story of our first anatomy lecture, and now we'll move on to the quiz.